Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We have a tremendous turnout. I want to thank you all and welcome you for coming here to the Van Plettenberg Historical Society's second event of the year. For tonight, I'm going to first talk about Baron Joachim van Plettenberg. George, is that right? Joachim. Thank you. He gave the name Plettenberg, and he was in charge in the Cape Colony. He succeeded Ryk Tolbach in 1772, and he was governor of the colony until 1774, only 2 years. Then he asked for leave of absence to go back to the Netherlands, where he died at The Hague a year later. So we thank Joachim van Plettenberg, and we pay tribute to him tonight. But even more tribute must go to Courtney Bradfield. Courtney has been a friend of mine for the last 20 years. I knew him when he was at Paternoster and had a bed and breakfast where my wife and I used to go twice a year on anniversary in January and birthday in September. But since then, Courtney and George are here in Plet at the Plet Manor, and Courtney is direct descendant of the 1820 settlers, and he has his forebears, 5 generations of his paternal family buried in a single graveyard in the Clumber Valley, just outside Bathurst, roughly halfway between Grahamstown and Port Alfred. Courtney knows a lot about the 1820 settlers, and he set you a challenge tonight. He said, this is the most callous mass migration, of people in the history of the British Empire. The whole plot was created by Lord Somerset, Governor of the Cape, and of course the British government. So between them they hatched this plot, and the people came out. And what they had to go through, only Courtney can explain. So it's over to Courtney Bradfield.
Thank you, Len, Mr. Chairman, committee members of the Historical Society. Thank you for inviting me and entrusting me with these few minutes. First of all, I'd just like to apologize to all of you. I have a persistent cough as a reminder of my session with COVID last year. It's still with me, so I will be sucking sweets. And my mother told me never to speak with my mouth full. Excuse me, Mom. I will be doing that, so please excuse me. Len has basically said that I'm part of the 5 generations. I am not an historian. Don't put me into that category. I'm merely a person who started being interested in my genealogy. And I wanted to know a little bit more about where I came from. And so, as I progressed with this, it was in the days of writing letters. We didn't have computers. We didn't have Google. You had to write a letter to an address and then wait for a reply. And that took many, many years. When I got some way into it, we were still farming in the Clumber Valley. And I realized that my forefathers, the names that I had come up with, were all on gravestones in the Clumber Church. And that made me want to know a little bit more. Where did they come from? Why did they come? What were their circumstances? So from that developed from the genealogy into the history of the 1820s. My grandfather, 5 times removed, I don't know what you call it. He was part of the 1820 settlers, John and his wife Mary. John was 50 with his family of 7. who came out with the Nottingham Party. And so John was my starting point. And in amongst his 7 was a Joseph at the age of 18 or 19, a young man. He married here. His son was Jonathan. Jonathan married and he had Edmund George. Edmund George had Granville Glasson. And Granville Glasson had me. So that's the progression. And interestingly enough, my mom is also a direct line 1820 settlers as well. So that's where I come from. I'm part of the 3,800 that came out, the 3,800 settlers. There were 28 ships, 67 parties. So in amongst that, I have to talk about the settlers in general. I cannot be talking about the individual parties. There's just too much. But I will be concentrating on the section of my history, which is the Nottingham Party, from Nottinghamshire, where they left from Nottingham itself. So that is where I'll be focusing on. Sorry, can you all hear? You okay? The Nottingham Party consisted of 167 people, 58 men, 27 women, and 82 children. And that's why when I was reading this history, I posed the question to myself about this comment that I picked up, written by an historian, and he called it the most callous act of mass immigration in the history of the British Empire. So our story tonight, I leave you to see whether that is a true fact or not. The story starts here, Lord Charles Somerset. Very controversial figure. He was the governor in the Cape Colony. He was the governor there from 1814 to 1826. So when the settlers arrived, he should have been there. And in fact, he wasn't. He went on leave when the settlers arrived. So controversial from the start. He was not a particularly liked man. He was very autocratic. He surrounded himself with yes men, and they gave him what he wanted to hear. So his communication with Britain was very biased. He was located far away from the eastern frontier. He was located in Cape Town, 600 miles away. So he was totally out of touch with what was happening. He also banned the free press. Thomas Pringle, from the Scottish Party, wanted to start a newspaper in Cape Town. He in fact brought his press out with him, and he was forbidden to do so. He would not allow freedom of the press. The proposal of his to locate the settlers in the eastern frontier was not a new idea. It had been put onto the table by the previous governor, but Somerset dusted the dust off and presented it to the government as a viable proposition in terms of forming a buffer along the eastern frontier, because he didn't want any influence coming through to the west. I suppose by putting people in a position.
2 minutes.
2 minutes while we put the
Generator on.
carry on. I'm just training my voice a bit. If you can all hear me.
Yeah.
So he suggested that they get settlers in and place them all along the Fish River boundary, and they create a buffer. Well, I think in modern language they would be called in today human shields. He started promoting this idea, and to get his approval from the Great Britain, he started a campaign. Many letters were going to the Home Office, and he started promoting the Eastern Cape in a way which was not quite truthful. He talked about the Eastern Cape as a series of parks, verdant, magnificent soil, plenty of game, and so the Home Office got this impression of, well, we've got problems here in Britain, let's send them over, let's send the settlers over. And he didn't really put a truthful picture. He also said, yes, you will have problems from your neighbours because they most probably will come and try and filch your cattle. But don't worry, we've got the military there, and if you stand together, well, you won't have any problems, which wasn't really true. Also, the amount of land that they thought they would allocate to each settler was 100 acres. 100 acres was wonderful in terms of England, with a steady rainfall, lovely soil, but 100 acres couldn't even classify it as a kitchen garden. So that was a problem to start off with. The other one was that he said the climate was salubrious. Well, it's far from salubrious because you have a mixture of droughts and torrential rains. So that was a totally incorrect picture which he put across. He did try and calm down things on the border because the neighbouring Xhosas were filching cattle already. There were Dutch farmers in the vicinity, and he was trying to get more to come through and settle, but that wasn't taken up. Nobody was really interested. And because they were being plundered all the time with their cattle, there were even attacks on the homesteads, and homesteads were burnt. So even more promotion for him to try and get other people in. He tried meeting with the chief of the Xhosas, Gaika, and Gaika he declared as paramount chief. Apparently he was paramount chief from the Xhosa side, and he had meetings with him as well as Mklambi. And they did that at Algoa Bay. They talked about it, and Gaika and Mklambi concurred that they shouldn't have been in the area. They recognized that this was an area under the British rule, and they said that they would go back to the other side. Unfortunately, Mklambi felt this was a betrayal, and when they got back, he automatically sent out of his own men to go and filch cattle, and they came away with something like 20 head of oxen. And so the trouble started once again. That eventually led to an enormous battle within the Xhosa clans, who got together to fight against Gaika. And that was one of the greatest slaughters in Xhosa history. Then in 1819, a year before the settlers arrived, 9,000 Xhosa streamed across the border, and they attacked Grahamstown. And that was a very close-run thing. But they called in all of the available resources to Grahamstown, which in turn left the whole colony wide open. And so they streamed in, took away huge amounts of cattle, and torched homesteads. So I think from that one can gather that USA talks about the Wild West. I think we had the Wild East. The Cape Colony. This was from Somerset's days. Cape Town, I reckon this was somewhere around Lambert's Bay. Down, and then you can see Graaff-Reinet up here. There are not many places that you can identify. Even Port Elizabeth down here is not listed as Port Elizabeth. That is still as Algoa Bay. And up here, roughly, would be where the majority of settlers would be placed. The Fish River, there's the boundary. That was declared as the boundary of the Cape Colony. There we go. This is the plan. This is the plan of the settlement that they envisaged. There's the Fish River. Down here is the Kauri. And all of these, as you can see, are forming a huge buffer on the Eastern Cape. At that stage, that was very sparsely populated, as I was saying, by the Dutch farmers. Here's Bathurst, which was really the epicenter. And my party, the Nottingham Party, was settling here in Clumber. Clumber was basically in the middle, Clumber. I know a lot of people don't know where Clumber is. We'll get to it a little bit later. That's the Clumber area. So that was basically in the center, and it was quite a thriving little colony at one stage. But the biggest problem was along the Fish River. That was very porous. And what he did was that he erected forts along that line, but they were far away from one another, and the patrols just couldn't handle the incursions. In fact, most of those soldiers were withdrawn and sent to India to quell rebellion there. So that's a bit of a background to what was expected of the settlers when they came out. And here we have a letter from John Bradfield, 1819, dated the 27th of October, asking that he be included in the list of immigrants to come out to South Africa. Interesting enough, and this is what I will be talking about, framework knitter, out of employment, draper, out of employment, framework knitter, out of employment. So in that one family, because they were unemployed, their wives, Mary, and the girls, were also unemployed because they used to help the fathers. So why did John Bradfield so earnestly request to come out to the Cape Colony, to the Wild East? When they put out this information, based on what Somerset advised them to do, 90,000 people applied of the 3,800 which were selected. And the idea was, I think, was to send out a second batch, which never materialized. And I think I know the reason why. What was happening in England? England was in turmoil. First of all, there was a need to reform the political system. The ordinary man did not have a vote. The aristocracy and the wealthy had increased numbers of votes. I think Lord Charles had something like 14 votes. So it was a very crazy situation. It was also the start of the Industrial Revolution. So people were coming into the cities and realizing that they had no recourse. Where do I go to? Who can I complain to? They weren't allowed to vote at all. Then the wealthy landowners passed a bill through Parliament to say, buy British. We will stop our imports of grain from Europe. And guess what they did? They pushed up prices. And with the result, bread, a staple food, was so expensive it was unaffordable. So there you've got a problem with food availability, and then you have huge unemployment. In 1815 there was the Battle of Waterloo, and there was something like 15 to 20,000 conservatively soldiers coming back into the marketplace. You have the Industrial Revolution with all of the cottage industries, like your framework knitters, suddenly closing down with their attendant wives, put those onto the marketplace. And of course, the population. The population in the UK jumped from 8 million in 1760 to 15 million in 1820. So a huge amount of people, and the net result was that people were actually starving. So the reason for him emigrating was very simple. The land that he was going to was utopia. He was going to get a piece of land. All he needed was somebody to sponsor him, because he couldn't afford that cost. Just remember that date, 27th of October. I'll come back to that just now. This is a framework knitter. I actually went onto YouTube, wanted to see what actually a framework knitter did. And it's very interesting because the gentlemen, the men of the household, used to do the knitting. The females used to take that work and finish it off. So it was a very complicated process. You'll see like organ bellows at the bottom. They had to work with that with coordination with their hands. Nottingham was the centre of the cottage industry. You had all the framework knitters, you had the lace making. And so when this market collapsed, because it went into the factories, Nottingham was sorely hit with all of these people coming onto the market. Things were so bad, people were starting to walk around with placards, pity our children, we are in distress, help us. The parishes were unable to feed and help all of these people that were coming to them. So there was a gentleman by the name of the Duke of Newcastle, and his idea was to try and promote the poor to leave. And he garnered money from friends, and they sponsored the Nottingham Party to come out to South Africa. So the entire Nottingham Party, with the exception of one person, was assisted. And they came out thanks to the sponsor, the Duke of Newcastle. And that is where the word Clumber comes from. Clumber was the estate of the Duke of Newcastle. So, 27th of October, you remember that? That happened. 12th of January, they were on their way. Mere 2 months after putting in their application. I'm absolutely astonished by that. Because when one thinks of the organization needed to move a group of people so quickly, it's beyond my comprehension. They had to organize transport from their homes all the way to their point of departure. They had to organize the ships. They had to organize housing, temporary housing in the colony. They had to organize food. But there they were. 12th of January, the women started leaving in the four-in-hand coach. 4 inside, 9 on the outside. And bear in mind, at that time of the year, January was winter. It was one of the most bitter winters that they had in the UK. There were ships frozen over, locked in the Thames. The Thames was frozen over. They were even skating on the Thames. So we know that they were locked in ice. So I wouldn't have liked to be on the outside on that coach. The journey itself to Liverpool from Nottingham, roughly, Google says it's about 150 kilometers. I don't know what it was like with the roads those days, but they managed to complete that journey in 1 day. The gentleman left, accompanied the wagons on which all of their goods were loaded, and they walked from Nottingham to Liverpool, and they spent 3 nights on the road. So the journey took them 4 days, and their arrival coincided with the first coach load of women and children. There's the little Albury, their vessel, which was sitting in the river, not at the docks in Liverpool. And I presume that it was not at the quayside, because I think they wanted to save some money. So, and I think also it was a deterrent for anybody who wanted to jump ship and think it was a bad idea. They wouldn't try and get out into the water. Really a relatively small ship, 330 tons, and the whole party was on board on the 26th of January. All of the souls were on board, and they were due to sail on the 27th. But a storm swept in. They were unable to hoist the sails, and they only left on the 13th of February. And on the 13th of February, there was the recorded death of 2 infants who were consigned to the deep. So the journey progressed. They came to the coast of Wales. Another huge storm hit the vessel, and the captain had to batten down the hatches. Now, I don't think anybody would appreciate that. They realized that if something happened to the ship, they had no chance of survival. So they caused a little bit of havoc and accused Captain Cunningham of not knowing what he was doing. But the conditions on board were something else. This is a drawing of an artist's impression of what he thought the settlers would be doing on board. They're sitting at tables. I think it's sort of a relaxed atmosphere. Albury was totally different. You could not stand up between the decks. You had to bend your head. 167 people on this ship, not able to bend your head, sleeping, the youngsters, singles, were given a blanket and had to find a place to sleep on the bare boards. The married couples were lying 4 to a bed, and in some cases 6 to a single bed. The leader of the party, Calton, Dr. Calton, wrote in his diary that he wondered that no mistakes were made. So they continued on their journey, roughly due south. This was the normal way that they went, through the doldrums in the equator, down to where the trade winds picked up, and then they would beat in to Cape Town. And then they arrived at Simonstown on May the 1st at midnight. I want to just try and explain to you what I mean by accommodating 167 persons. And I'm saying this is not the equivalent of what was happening on the Aubrey. Seeing it's Wimbledon, I give you the size of a tennis court. Everybody knows a tennis court. Try and put that in your mind, how big a tennis court is, just the playing surface. The Aubrey was far less than the size of a tennis court. When they arrived on May the 1st, Calton disembarked and he went to see the Foreign Office. The settlers were not allowed to get off, and so they stayed on board while Calton did his business. And then a strange thing happened. 2 ships had to go back to the UK to do some other work. And there were 2 parties waiting to be transported to Algoa Bay. And guess what happened? They came onto the Aubrey. And now we had over 300 people on the size of a tennis court. I wouldn't have liked to be in there. They arrived at Algoa Bay on the 15th of May. There they go. They, 15th of May they arrived, but they had to wait 2 weeks. The boats were arriving. In fact, when the Aubrey docked, there were another 2 ships that came in on the same day. And so they had to get in. It was quite an involved process. Here you can see there's a ship's boat. Over here you can see a ship's boat. I suppose what we would call our lifeboats of today. So people would disembark into that, and then they would be loaded into a flat bottom boat. And from that, you'll see that there is a rope which goes right through the ship, or the flat bottom boat, and they would be pulled ashore. So when in the pulling, you either went over the wave or you went through it. But it was a secure method of getting them ashore, much better than trying to get oars. This one, the artist has also put in what was waiting for them. Tents. 2,000 tents placed on the seashore, waiting for their arrival. When the Nottingham party arrived, there were already 1,000 people in the queue waiting for their transport to take them on to their final destination. Their final destination was by ox wagon, something which was totally foreign for them. They had never seen anything like it. 12 or 14 oxen in a span, and they required 30 wagons. So I just put in a photograph of 2 wagons. Leave it in your mind's eye what 30 looked like. And multiply that by 12, and how many oxen bellowing, and the dust. Men actually walked on the sides of the ox wagon, and so did the women. The woman tried to get on board the ox wagons, they were jolted so much they ended up with bruises. So when they had an opportunity, they would hitch a ride. This is the route which they followed from Algoa Bay. They took a route which is called the coastal route. The normal route would be from Algoa Bay up to Grahamstown. That is what we would call the N2, because it was feeding, it was a thoroughfare for the fort here, Fort Frederick, and Fort Selwyn in Grahamstown. So there was lots of traffic backwards and forwards. So that was like an N2. The coastal route was an R something, R102, but it was definitely like a track. They would move crossing the rivers upstream. They couldn't do it at the mouth. The mouths were too deep, and they could only do them inland. So the Bushmans and the Kariga River, there's a Theopolis mission which they stopped at to get supplies, and then they got to Port Alfred, the Kawi River, and they couldn't do this upstream because the banks of the Kawi River are too precipitous. So they crossed the Kawi River. This was done by quantity surveyor John Biddulph in 1820. So we know exactly what the Kawi River mouth looked like. It was rather tricky. They would come in from Theopolis, the mission station. They would come in. The Kawi River had two streams, one going that way, the other going the other. There were two sand beds there and here. Those sand beds were covered at high tide, so they could only cross over at low tide. Try to get 30 wagons across at low tide. This was the bad one. We have reports of the oxen crossing over through that, with the water flowing over the oxen's backs. And in fact, one little boy was drowned while crossing over, not in the Nottingham party. Where did they land up, the Nottingham party? They landed up here at Clumber, and they reached that on the 25th of July. So they left 13th of February, arriving the 25th of July, but they were all aboard the Albury on the 26th. So a full 4 months. They arrived here. There was a little hill there. The wagons offloaded everybody here, and they called that Mount Mercy, because they held a service of thanksgiving for their safe arrival. It was heartrending actually to read the account of that arrival, because the wagons arrived, offloaded, and departed, and left them all alone. There were no homes to welcome them. There was no welcome banners. There they were. They were not allowed to have any labour. They had to do things themselves or collectively. And their first thing that they had to do was obviously pitch their tents. But they knew that they couldn't live in those tents for long. So the first thing they did was to try and clear the lands. That had to be done manually. Then they had to try and get some lands cleared for putting down their wheat. They were given rations, so they had no problem with food initially. but they had to sow and do it pretty quickly. The rations were only for 2 years or until their first crops came in. Once that period of time had elapsed, that was it. They were on their own. Pardon me. The thing to remember when they arrived here, there was no infrastructure. Bathurst was 3 or 4 houses. Port Elizabeth was the same. Algoa Bay was its name. Grahamstown, also military outpost, very few houses. There were no roads, there were no tarred roads. They had to walk to get anywhere. I mentioned just now that they were given rations. They had to get to Bathurst to go and collect those rations. How do you get there? When you get there, how do you load up your rations? How do you get them back home? The rations included meat, which took the shape of live sheep. Now you've got to drive your sheep home. How do you do that? A lot of those sheep just got lost in the thickets. So it was not easy. And in 1821, they had their first death. A little boy, a cattle herder, was murdered. Then their crops failed. 1821, their crops came up, their wheat looked absolutely magnificent, and then something called rust developed. While it was just budding, everything died. So they planted again in 1822. And again, what happened? Rust. Now their rations were going to stop. So they had the unfortunate prospect of no food. In 1823, there was the natural calamity called the Great Flood. For 3 weeks it rained. The first week was heavy rain. The second week was torrential downpours. The third week was gentle rain. Now, in the Eastern Cape, the rivers there are what can be called, not rivers, they're more little streams or called rills of water. That was where the settlers actually built their homes, to be close to water. Their crops were close to the water, so they could water them. These rivers came down, washed away all of the fields and all of their homes. So, back to square one. By this stage, the settlers were in distress. They were still in their same clothes that they'd arrived in. They had no shoes, they were walking barefoot. Their clothes were mended. They used their old tents, the old material, and they tried to mend their clothes. And sometimes they even used the calico to make their own clothes. And they used palm fronds to make their hats. By which stage they had asked for a meeting with Somerset to say, please, we need to get with you to try and understand what we can do. How do we go forward? Somerset did not want to meet with them, and he turned them down. So the settlers then had no alternative but to send their letter of grievances to England, which incensed Charles Somerset. But it was the first inkling of what was happening. The authorities were then alerted that Somerset was supplying information A, the actual people were supplying information B, and they didn't come together. They realized there was something afoot. So they set up a commission of inquiry. They came out, they met with the settlers, horrified to see what they looked like, and they went back and they said unequivocally, we have a problem. Also, what was interesting to note was that a lot of the settlers on their land had left because they were not farmers. In the Nottingham party, there were 30% were framework knitters, the rest were labourers, drapers, stonemasons, nothing to do with farming. There was only one farmer, John Sykes, and he died on the trip over. So there was nobody to show them the way on how to farm. And half of the settlers had already left their lands, and they took up residence in the little towns of Bathurst, Grahamstown, Port Elizabeth. And that's when they commenced the buildings of those cities. And then in 1834, absolute disaster. 21st of December, the 6th Border War. The very first the settlers had experienced. 12,000 warriors crossed over the Fish River from north to south and attacked the colony. Lieutenant Colonel Somerset, Charles Somerset's son, ordered the evacuation of Bathurst, and he ordered the closure of some of the forts, which left the entire colony open and exposed to all of these warriors coming in. It was so bad, the original objective was to reach Port Elizabeth, and they stopped 20 kilometres short at Uitenhage. That's when they stopped them. The women and children from the Nottingham party had to leave immediately, December the 24th. They went to Bathurst to try and take shelter in an unfinished church. Because they had been told to evacuate Bathurst, it was deemed that they could not be afforded protection, so they left under guard in 60 wagons, 60, to Grahamstown. They were attacked along the way, and 4 Xhosa were killed in that encounter. So, to give you an idea of the scale of the devastation, this is from a diary of Elijah Pike, an 1820 settler. Now, I don't know whether these figures are correct. I have checked them and they seem to be more or less right. But let's just halve them. Just have a look at this. The losses: 5,715 horses, 111,000 head of cattle, 161,000 sheep, 456 houses and wagons consumed by fire. 300 houses were pillaged, and all the extending crops were burnt. That to me was quite remarkable. I could not believe that those people had endured so much. And so, from there, to today, this is an aerial view of the Clumber Church, built in 1867. This is the third church. They built the first one in 1825, which is quite a miracle, because 1825, remember that the Nottingham party were paupers. So 5 years after they landed, the first church was erected. The second church was erected in 1837, which is just after the border war. And that one was entered also at a later stage during another war. And this one finally in 1867. It's a church which is built on what we call Mount Mercy. There's the little mount, flattened a little bit through this aerial photograph. But it stands in history because here at the bottom is where they landed in 1820 when the wagons rolled in. And I've put here that a church which combines the present with the past. Looking down that level piece of ground at the base where the 30 ox wagons rolled in 200 years ago. A monument, a landmark, a thumbprint in the beautiful Clumber Valley, surrounded by graves. Interred here are 1820 settlers and their descendants, such as mine, men who actually fought in the Battle of Waterloo, a young girl murdered while tending her cattle, teachers from the early Clumber School, 1840s, a solid reminder and a presence of history of those men and women who persevered and with grit and determination overcame all. We will continue to honour them, their incredible tenacity, their strength of will, their faith in building a new future full of promise and hope for all of their descendants, like me, who will never know the depths of the lows which they experienced, but the proof is that they rose above it and left us, their descendants, an incredible story of which we can be immensely proud. I leave you with this. What are your thoughts on that statement earlier? Is it the most callous mass immigration of people in the history of the British Empire? Thank you.
Thank you, Courtney. That was a most interesting presentation of the 1820 settlers and his descendants, and people that have come from far away and a really callous mass migration from the British Empire. Okay, I want to give Courtney a present and present him with something from the Van Plettenberg Historical Society.
Is this the most callous act?
Well, this is, this is for you. You can open it up so you can see what it is. Wait, let's open it up for you. Can we have the lights, please?
Apparently not working as
Lights, camera, action.
I've got my biltong knife here.
Careful, my hands are underneath. Ah, wonderful. Wowie.
So for Courtney, he must
look at
remember
that.
he doesn't have to go in the Albury. He can, like Jonah, have a better form of transport.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Courtney? No questions. We've got, here's the question.
Ivan Boardman.
Ivan Boardman, what do you want to say something?
Ivan Boardman from, obviously, who came out in the Alliance.
Okay.
Just a little fact, obviously I've tracked all the way back through to where he came from and all that happened. One of the things that did happen is that a lot of the people that did come across weren't the poor of the poor. They were all fairly well trained in some areas. So when they actually came out, although they weren't farmers, they actually could then do other things. They went obviously to Grahamstown, they actually went all over the country, and that's where basically all our towns grew from, and a lot of our engineering came from. So it was quite, from that point of view, it was, as you say, not very easy. But it was, I've got a little bit of things say it was a total, when you actually looked at the people at that stage, there was nothing else to do. They were poor, they couldn't eat, and when you actually saw how many people actually applied and how many people went, they chose a lot of the better people to come to South Africa. And they actually did very well, I think. Just a point that I sort of said. I've actually done a lot of history going back to the UK and all the people that actually went. And they actually said it was probably one of the best things they did do, was actually leave the UK rather than stay there over that period of time.
Well, number one, I'm referring here specifically, as I've said, to the Nottingham Party. That's the first one. The other one, you know, a lot of them, yes, were, that's okay. A lot of them were qualified. And that's why I said that they moved in to Grahamstown and Port Elizabeth, and they created those cities, without a doubt. But a lot of them, some of them came out as gentlemen farmers. Some of them were artisans, like you can see with the composition of the Nottingham Party. They could also contribute to society. But the majority of them, they didn't even know how to plant. You know, they didn't even know how to build houses. There's records of some of the settlers coming out from their tents, which were temporary housing. Some of them actually dug holes and lived in the holes. Others found crevices in the rocks. Others found shelter in caves. Those are maybe extreme cases, but that gives you some idea of the realities, because there was nothing there. There were no settlements at all. Grahamstown was merely a couple of houses, same as Port Elizabeth. They didn't have any infrastructure to fall back on. No doctors.
Any other questions?
Just a bit about the environment, the harshness of it, and those of us who have descended from the 1820 settlers and know what that thorn felt is like, from Alexandra down towards Kenton-on-Sea and up to Kasuka and Port Alfred. That is that horrible thorn felt. I mean, even today, how some of those dairy farmers, like the Fords, who are 1820 settlers, and so on, have made successful farms in that harsh thorn felt of that area of the Eastern Cape.
Don't forget that there was also another name for that area, and that was called the Zierveld, Sauerveld. And that was because the grass was unpalatable for the cows at certain times of the year. And so you have to then start introducing, either feeding the animals or introducing different grasses for them to consume during the entire year. So, yeah, they had to get to know that. They had to get to know what to plant. Once the wheat had failed, they moved from agrarian to pastoral. So they started getting more and more cattle. And that is one of the reasons why they were plundered so much, because the Xhosas considered their wealth lay in cattle. And there were these huge amounts of cattle ready for filching. So,
They didn't know how to plant mealies, they knew that you could grow mealies, but in one of the old family diaries, they explained how they were so wrong. They used to take a whole mealie cob,
Yes.
the whole thing, and plant it in the ground. You know.
Yeah.
So needless to say, you've got a great number of sprouts
Yeah.
coming off that mealie cob.
Question in the back, yeah.
Is it me?
Yes.
My father was a man,
Hmm.
and the Mandy's came out in the Nautilus. The Nautilus and the Chapman came with the first ones. to come out.
Chapman was the first, yes.
Yes, and my grandfather was Bradfield.
Okay.
So I want to know if I'm related to you.
You will be. You will be. There were, as I said, 7 children.
Well,
And all of those, what we've got left in South Africa are Bradfields, are all related. So,
well, my grandfather was brought up in Salem,
okay.
and then he bought a land between Bathurst and Port Alfred, and he became a pineapple farmer there. And yes, he was Joshua.
Well, there we go. Joshua and Jonathan, I think, were brothers.
Okay,
Yeah.
yes. And then he died, and then my father, the man, took over the farm.
Okay.
Okay.
Mm,
So
lovely.
you my cousin?
Yes.
There you are. We've got a relative here.